The story of the great house began long before a single stone was laid, long before its silhouette rose over Newport's cliffs. Its origin lived in the quiet determination of a family that arrived in America with little more than skill, discipline, and the conviction that life could be rebuilt from the ground up. The Berwind household, shaped by German order and immigrant resilience, carried within it the engine that would one day power an empire. Their father crafted pianos with meticulous precision, creating instruments for wealthy families whose lives seemed unreachable from his small Philadelphia workshop. Yet his children learned early that, in America, background was only the starting point. What truly mattered was how far ambition could push the boundaries of circumstance. Among the Berwind sons, it was Edward who absorbed this lesson most intensely. From a young age, he understood that rising in the world required not only effort, but the ability to recognize opportunity even before it presented itself clearly. When the unexpected appointment to the United States Naval Academy arrived, signed personally by Abraham Lincoln, it was as if the door to a different universe had opened. The discipline of Annapolis did more than train him in engineering and navigation. It sharpened his belief that structure, order, and vision were forces powerful enough to reshape a life. And when his naval career came to an early close, Edward faced a crossroads that could have ended the momentum of his ascent. Instead, he stepped into the growing world of American industry, where coal was becoming the black fuel feeding the country's rapid transformation. Working under his older brother, who had already built a foothold in the mining business, Edward entered a domain where every decision held the potential to increase power or lose it. Coal in the late 19th century was more than a resource. It was influence, leverage, and access. As the company expanded, absorbing more land and striking deals with railroads, factories, and eventually the financial elite, Edward discovered that the true currency of industrial America was not just money, but the aura of command. His partnership with powerful bankers turned him into one of the country's most influential industrialists, a man whose operations stretched across more than 100,000 acres. Yet, even as his fortune grew, something else began to surface within him. A need to shape not only a business empire, but a visible, unmistakable expression of what he had become. The more America recognized his influence, the more Edward realized that wealth alone was no longer enough to define identity. In the circles he entered, homes were not merely dwellings, but declarations of status, artistry, and lineage. The grand estates rising in Newport were not casual indulgences. They were cultural monuments announcing who truly belonged among the nation's most refined. Each summer, as he visited the coastal enclave where industrial dynasties displayed their triumphs through architecture, Edward confronted a quiet but persistent truth. Success required a stage, and without one, even vast wealth remained incomplete. It was in this atmosphere that the idea of creating a residence unlike anything he had ever known began to take shape. The property he owned in Newport served well enough for holidays, but it lacked the depth, sophistication, and symbolic weight demanded by the society he had entered. Around him, palatial homes inspired by Europe's greatest traditions rose with breathtaking confidence. Italian palazzi, English manors, French chateaux, each one a sculpted message in stone that its owners had arrived not only financially, but culturally. For a man who had climbed from the disciplined order of an immigrant household to the highest ranks of American industry, the notion of building a house that reflected this journey became irresistible. Yet the vision forming in Edward's mind was not the dream of a comfortable retreat. It was something larger, almost ceremonial in purpose, a residence that would embody the refinement he had encountered abroad, the power he commanded at home, and the enduring story of a family that had risen from modest origins to stand among the elite. It needed to be a place where the past, present, and future converged, a home that transcended its practical function and became, instead, a personal monument. And once the decision took root, the question evolved naturally from why to how. The ambitions were in place, the resources were abundant. What remained was the form. What shape could possibly contain a life that had traveled so far and a legacy that aimed to travel even farther? When Edward began imagining a residence worthy of his rising stature, he carried with him the discipline of a naval officer and the strategic instincts of an industrialist. But what he lacked, and what no amount of wealth or business acumen could teach, was the refined cultural instinct that separated a mere mansion from a true expression of aristocratic elegance. That missing element entered his life in the form of Sarah Vesta Hermione Tora, a woman whose upbringing had unfolded worlds away from Pennsylvania, coal fields, and Philadelphia boardrooms. Raised in the Tuscan port city of Livorno, where her father served as an American consular agent, she absorbed the textures, colors, and rhythms of European culture as naturally as breathing. From childhood, Sarah had lived among palazzi lined with Renaissance ceramics, galleries filled with Venetian canvases, and streets shaped by centuries of architectural evolution. She understood instinctively the difference between imitation and authenticity, between decoration and heritage. While American families of new wealth often purchased European objects simply because they were fashionable, Sarah recognized the deeper meaning behind each artifact, the lineage it represented, the craftsmanship embedded within it, the cultural message it carried. When she and Edward married, their partnership became something far more complex than a merging of personal lives. It fused his ambition with her cultivated eye, turning the idea of a grand house into a project shaped by genuine artistic intelligence. As they traveled through Italy and France, Sarah guided Edward through galleries, salons, and private collections, with the assurance of someone who had long understood the language of art. She knew which Venetian dealers could be trusted, which French workshops produced furniture fit for noble estates, and which ceramics bore the unmistakable signatures of their eras. Under her direction, they began acquiring pieces not for quantity, but for pedigree. 18th-century Venetian scenes with documented provenance, refined French panels crafted during the reign of Louis XVI, and delicate jades from distant markets that quietly announced global sophistication. With each acquisition, Sarah was shaping a vision. The home they would build one day must feel as though it belonged to the European lineage from which these objects descended. It was Sarah who recognized that American architecture of the time, impressive though it often was, lacked the centuries of cultural layering that gave European residences their depth. She saw in the chateau of France a blend of precision, harmony, and grace that aligned perfectly with Edward's disciplined personality and with their shared desire to create something enduring. French neoclassical design, especially from the mid-18th century, possessed a balance that felt both grand and restrained, ornate yet intelligent. It was neither flamboyant nor heavy-handed. Rather, it expressed refinement through proportion, geometry, and light, qualities that translated perfectly into the image of a family striving not merely for recognition, but for legitimacy. French architecture also carried a subtle social power. To American society, which still looked across the Atlantic for cultural validation, a French-inspired residence did more than demonstrate taste. It hinted at lineage, education, and cultivated identity. In a world where industrial fortunes were often dismissed as brash or newly formed, adopting the visual language of European aristocracy signaled that the owners were not simply wealthy, but worldly. Sarah understood this dynamic instinctively. Her influence ensured that the future house would never appear as an American approximation of European style. Instead, it would carry the authority of a place designed by people who knew, intimately, what true French elegance required. As their vision matured, it became increasingly clear that no ordinary architect could translate this dream into reality. The project demanded someone capable of blending the structural innovation expected by an industrial titan with the aesthetic subtlety mastered by European artisans. It required a designer who understood the discipline of symmetry, the precision of ornament, and the importance of creating a home that did not merely imitate France, but felt as though it had been transported directly from its chateau-lined valleys. The ambition was clear, the style was chosen. What remained was finding a master builder capable of translating taste and aspiration into stone. When the idea of creating a residence worthy of European nobility finally crystallized, Edward and Sarah found themselves standing before a challenge that required not only wealth, but the precise mind of an architect able to merge two worlds. They needed someone who could take Sarah's cultivated vision of French refinement and Edward's demand for technical innovation, and forge them into a single, unmistakable statement in stone. This was no small task. The architectural world of the late 19th century was filled with talented designers, yet Few possess the combination of restraint, artistry, and engineering mastery necessary to build a French chateau that felt both authentic and forward-looking on American soil. Among the rising American architects of the era, Horace Trumbauer stood out not for flamboyance, but for discipline. Still early in his career, he had already designed several grand homes for wealthy industrialists and had earned a reputation for listening carefully, absorbing expectations deeply, and delivering structures that exceeded their owners' ambitions. What made Trumbauer unusual, and ultimately essential to the Berwind project, was his ability to interpret European forms not as static templates, but as living languages. He understood that a chateau was not simply a collection of elegant rooms and symmetrical facades. It was a cultural declaration, a narrative crafted through proportion, material, and detail. When Edward approached him, Trumbauer recognized immediately that the future house needed to be more than large or impressive. It had to be convincing. To ground the design in authenticity, Trumbauer and Sarah turned to some of the most celebrated French residences of the 18th century. Chief among their inspirations was the Château d'Asnières, near Paris, a work of refined neoclassical balance that embodied the elegance of the Louis XVI's period. With its clean lines, serene facade, and disciplined ornamentation, Asnières offered a model that aligned perfectly with Sarah's taste and Edward's desire for dignified grandeur. Yet, Trumbauer did not intend to create a replica. Instead, he studied the architectural vocabulary of the chateau, its rhythm of windows, the slope of its roofline, the articulation of its balustrades, and used these elements as a foundation upon which a new vision could be built. Other French estates contributed to the inspiration as well. Hôtels particuliers in Paris, rural manors shaped by the Enlightenment's aesthetic ideals, and even royal residences where classical geometry guided every curve and cornice. From each example, Trumbauer extracted principles rather than specific features. He wanted the new house to feel undeniably French, yet adapted to the scale, light, and landscape of Newport. The challenge lay in blending European elegance with American ambition, respecting the past without becoming bound to it. What made the project daring within the context of American architecture was not merely its scale, but its ambition to achieve true stylistic accuracy. At the turn of the century, many wealthy Americans built residences inspired by European traditions, but few went so far as to research the architectural lineage with such seriousness. Many houses of the era combined elements loosely, creating eclectic mixes that imitated the feeling of Europe without understanding its structural logic. Trumbauer refused such shortcuts. His commitment to precision elevated the undertaking from fashionable imitation to architectural scholarship. He also understood that Edward expected innovation as well as beauty. Coal financed the project, but electricity, modern engineering, and fireproof materials would define its internal structure. Trumbauer's design, therefore, combined a steel skeleton, a rarity in residential construction at the time, with limestone facades shaped to convey softness and symmetry. Behind walls that evoked the 18th century lay some of the most advanced systems of the early 20th. This interplay of Old World grace and New World power was precisely what made the project so bold. It required the rigor of a historian, the imagination of an artist, and the technical confidence of an engineer. By the time Trumbauer completed the initial plans, the vision of a French chateau on the cliffs of Newport had transformed from an idea into a blueprint ready to challenge the limits of American residential architecture. The design captured the essence of European refinement without sacrificing the ambition of an industrial titan. Now, with the aesthetic and structural foundations in place, the next task loomed before them: the immense undertaking of raising this imagined palace from the earth and turning ink on paper into towering limestone reality. When construction began, Newport's quiet streets had never witnessed anything quite like the spectacle that unfolded on the Berwind property. What would eventually become a serene limestone chateau first emerged as a roaring hive of activity. Hundreds of workers, towering scaffolds, and a foundation so deep and meticulously engineered that locals joked it looked as though a second house was being built underground. Yet even at this chaotic early stage, it was clear that the project differed from every other mansion rising in the exclusive summer colony. This was not simply another wealthy family's statement. It was a deliberate attempt to bring European architectural philosophy into the American present, supported by industrial muscle. The first task was reshaping the land itself. The chosen site required extensive leveling to support the sheer weight of the future structure. Teams carved into the earth, installing drainage systems that would protect the building for decades, ensuring groundwater could never threaten the foundation. At a time when many American homes still relied on basic stone and mortar footings, the Elms demanded a more advanced approach. Precision mattered not only for stability, but for the strict symmetry Trumbauer envisioned. Every measurement was checked, recalibrated, and checked again, as though the building were a mechanical instrument being tuned. But the most shocking innovation came when workers began assembling the steel skeleton, a framework usually reserved for commercial towers and industrial complexes. For a residence, such construction was almost unheard of. Yet the dangers of fire were a lesson Newport knew too well. Only a few years earlier, the original Breaker's Mansion had been lost to flames. Trumbauer and Edward refused to take that risk. A steel structure, wrapped in terracotta fireproofing blocks and encased in limestone, ensured that the new house would endure not just the elements, but time itself. As beams rose into place, the outline of a massive, unyielding form took shape, a quiet statement of permanence even before a single decorative detail appeared. Around this skeletal frame, masons began dressing the building in pale Indiana limestone, shipped east by rail. Each block had been quarry cut to approximate size, but true shaping happened on site. Craftsmen worked with almost ceremonial precision, shaving edges, smoothing surfaces, and positioning stones so tightly that the seams seemed to vanish into the facade. To observers, it appeared as though a French chateau were emerging directly from the ground rather than being assembled piece by piece. The stone captured sunlight softly during the day and held a quiet glow in the early evening, hinting even then at the refined beauty the completed residence would soon display. Beneath the elegance, however, lay intricate systems meant to remain invisible. One of the cleverest engineering solutions was the coal delivery tunnel hidden beneath the property. Rather than allowing wagons or soot-covered workers to approach the house, coal traveled along narrow tracks through a buried passage, feeding directly into the basement furnace rooms. The system not only kept the grounds pristine, but reinforced the illusion that the household operated effortlessly, without the labor and machinery that powered it. Other early innovations included a pioneering drainage network, carefully placed vents that kept the internal structure dry, and concealed service corridors that would later allow staff to move through the home without disturbing family or guests. Everything was designed with dual purposes: beauty above, efficiency below. While the public would one day marvel at the symmetry of the facade, few would ever know how much of the house's intelligence lay hidden within its walls. By late 1900, the exterior had taken on its final form, massive yet graceful. It evoked the aristocratic confidence of its European muses. The slate roofline cut a sharp silhouette against the sky, and the limestone walls stood serene and flawless. But inside, the chateau remained hollow, a magnificent shell awaiting its soul. The raw interior rooms, still marked by exposed brick, rough plaster, and unfinished floors, felt like a blank manuscript ready for its story. What would fill these grand spaces? What artistic choices would transform mere architecture into a living expression of culture? The answers lay in the hands of masters from across the Atlantic, soon to arrive and breathe life into the empty corridors. Once the limestone walls and steel frame defined the outer shape of the residence, the real transformation began. Not through construction crews, but through artisans whose work carried the weight of centuries of European tradition. To bring the interior to life, Edward and Sarah entrusted the project to Jules Allard and Sons, the Parisian firm renowned for furnishing actual French chateaux. Their arrival in America for this commission signaled that the Berwind home would not simply mimic European elegance, but embody it through authentic craftsmanship. From the moment Allard's designers walked into the empty shell of the house, they treated it not as a new structure, but as a canvas that needed to whisper the cultural language of the 18th century. They studied the proportions of each room, the natural light patterns across the day, and the way the family's growing art collection could anchor the spaces. Unlike many wealthy homeowners who purchased art as decoration, Edward and Sarah possessed pieces of genuine artistic pedigree, Venetian canvases painted for noble families, Renaissance ceramics preserved through generations, and rare jades that suggested an appreciation for global artistry. These treasures dictated much of the interior design, guiding the layout, palette, and purpose of each space. For the dining room, which would showcase the Venetian paintings, Allard crafted a setting that allowed the canvases to dominate while still harmonizing with the architectural elements. Walls were paneled in warm-tone woods carved with understated detail, framing the artwork without overwhelming it. Subtle gilding highlighted certain contours, catching candlelight and drawing the eye toward the painting's intricate scenes. Every inch of the room was calibrated to support the collection, turning meals into experiences that blended cultural heritage with social performance. In the drawing room, where Renaissance ceramics would rest in custom-made vitrines, the atmosphere shifted to lighter, more delicate tones. Here, Allard favored soft greens and creams, reflecting the classical grace of the pieces Sarah had acquired. Decorative moldings were sculpted with precision, evoking motifs found in French aristocratic estates. Carved garlands, rosettes, and scrollwork added quiet sophistication, while mirrored panels amplified natural light, making the room feel simultaneously intimate and luminous. The materials used throughout the house were chosen not only for beauty, but for authenticity. Imported marble from Italy and France brought cool, polished surfaces that carried the weight of European tradition. Fine woods, including walnut, beech, and oak, were carved by artisans whose skills had been passed down through generations. Hand-painted panels, created in Parisian workshops, were shipped across the Atlantic and installed with surgical precision. Even the upholstery fabrics, silks, brocades, and damasks, were selected to reflect periods and motifs that match the architectural narrative Sarah envisioned. But beyond the materials and artistry, technology played a subtle, revolutionary role. Allard's craftsmen designed the rooms so that modern conveniences, like electrical wiring, would remain invisible. Fixtures disguised early electric bulbs within ornate sconces and chandeliers, allowing light to fill spaces without breaking the illusion of historical continuity. Service corridors were hidden behind seamless wall panels, ensuring that movement in the house remained discreet. Every decision reinforced the idea that the home should appear not as a newly constructed American mansion, but as an inherited European estate, perfected through generations. As the interiors neared completion, the house began to feel alive. The echoing shell transformed into a sequence of carefully orchestrated environments, each one reflecting a balance between art, architecture, and lived experience. Visitors who would eventually enter these rooms would sense not just luxury, but a quiet, deliberate effort to connect the new world to the old through taste, intellect, and craftsmanship. Yet, even as the rooms took shape, one fundamental question remained. What would surround this palace? For a residence inspired by French chateaux, the setting mattered almost as much as the structure itself. The house was nearly ready to receive its first guests, but the world outside its doors still waited to be formed, and so attention turned from carved paneling and gilded ornament to the sweeping landscape beyond the limestone walls. A place where gardens, fountains, and avenues would need to echo the grandeur unfolding inside. When the house finally stood complete, elegant and commanding in its limestone symmetry, it still felt suspended between worlds. Its rooms glowed with European artistry, its facades carried the calm authority of a French chateau, but beyond its doors lay open land, raw and undirected. For the residence to achieve its intended identity, the surrounding grounds needed to echo the same cultural lineage that shaped the interiors. 14 acres stretched outward from the house, waiting to be shaped into a landscape that would make the chateau feel not merely placed in Newport, but rooted in a tradition that reached back centuries. The first landscape plan proposed for the property was serviceable but uninspired, a naturalistic arrangement of plantings, winding paths, and a modest lily pond. Pleasant enough, it failed to provide the sense of ceremony and order that a French-inspired home demanded. A house modeled after aristocratic palaces could not simply rest in a gentle meadow. It required an environment that reinforced its status from the very moment a visitor approached. Recognizing this, the Berwinds brought in landscape designers with a deeper understanding of European formal gardens, including Jacques Greber, a French landscape architect whose fluency in classical design transformed the vision entirely. With Greber's guidance, the grounds were reimagined as a grand extension of the house. The core principle was symmetry, an organizing force used in the gardens of Versailles, Fontainebleau, and countless estates of the French Enlightenment. From the back of the house, a vast allée unfurled like a green carpet, stretching toward the horizon in a straight, disciplined line. Its scale was unmistakably European, designed to draw the eye forward and outward, creating a feeling of boundless order and composure. Walking down this living corridor, one felt the same architectural logic that shaped the chateau's interior, translated into earth, grass, and sky. To anchor the ends of this grand vista, marble pavilions were erected, small in size but immense in effect. They served as focal points, offering balance to the long sweep of lawn, while adding sculptural punctuation to the landscape. Their pale stone gleamed in sunlight, echoing the limestone of the main house and visually tying the gardens back to the architecture. Between them, cross-axes of smaller paths intersected the allée, each bordered by manicured hedges and dotted with urns imported from European workshops. Beyond the main lawn, a sunken garden unfolded like a secret chamber beneath the open sky. This was one of Greber's most intricate creations, a secluded space carved into the land where patterns of boxwood hedges formed delicate geometric designs. Here, the symmetry became intimate, closer to the scale of a drawing room than the vastness of the grand lawn. Flowers introduced seasonal color, while sculptural figures watched over the garden from carefully chosen vantage points. Each element felt deliberate, as though placed by an invisible hand guiding the visitor through an orchestrated experience of beauty and calm. Throughout the gardens, fountains added movement and sound. Jets of water arched into the air with a precision that complemented the geometric order of the landscape. Bronze dolphins and mythological figures adorned the basins, their surfaces catching light and sending ripples across the water. These fountains served not just as decoration, but as a subtle soundtrack for the estate, softening the grandeur with gentle rhythm. Even the trees contributed to the design's narrative. Originally, the mansion was framed by sweeping lines of American elms, graceful silhouettes that inspired the house's name. When disease later took the elms, the Berwinds replaced them with weeping beeches, whose cascading branches brought a new kind of elegance to the grounds. Nature, architecture, and human intention merged into a unified vision, transforming the property into an outdoor palace worthy of the structure it embraced. The gardens did much more than beautify the estate, they completed it. Walking from the house into the open air felt like stepping into a grand exterior hall where sky replaced ceiling, but design still dictated every perspective. Together, the interior and exterior created a world where European refinement thrived thousands of miles from its origins. A world that demanded not only admiration, but maintenance. A landscape so perfectly composed required constant attention. Gardeners trimming hedges into precise lines, tending flowers with seasonal precision, clearing pathways so the geometry remained uninterrupted. But for all its splendor, the estate was still only a stage. A palace, whether built of stone or greenery, needs movement, people, and rhythm to transform it from a static creation into a living world. And so, as the gardens matured into their full grandeur, the question arose naturally: how would this house function, day after day, to maintain the illusion of effortless beauty? Behind its serene facade, an entire unseen system awaited, one powered not by machinery alone, but by an invisible army whose work made the chateau breathe. Long before visitors admired the polished floors, glittering chandeliers, or carefully groomed gardens, the house possessed a hidden identity. One built not from marble and ornament, but from machines, wires, pipes, and ingenious systems that quietly pushed it decades ahead of its time. While its exterior whispered of 18th century France, its internal structure belonged to an entirely different century. The Elms operated with a level of technological sophistication that most American families would not encounter until long into the future, making the residence as much an engineering marvel as an architectural one. At the heart of this innovation was electricity. At a moment when many households still relied on gas lamps or hybrid systems, the Elms embraced a fully electric design with remarkable confidence. More than 1,500 bulbs illuminated the residence, each one contributing to a layered glow that felt almost magical compared to the flickering, uneven light of gas fixtures. The decision to rely entirely on electricity was bold. The technology was still new, and outages were common, but the Berwinds accepted the risk for the promise of a brighter, cleaner, more reliable home. Wiring ran discreetly behind walls and ceilings, hidden with a precision that allowed Allard's interiors to maintain their European purity without visible intrusion from the modern world. The electric refrigeration system was equally pioneering. Long before such appliances became standard, the Elms employed one of the earliest residential ice-making machines in the country. This massive device occupied its own area in the basement, humming steadily as it produced cold air and ice without relying on deliveries from outside vendors. Its presence transformed the household's rhythm. Champagne could be chilled at any hour, perishables stored safely, and meals prepared with a consistency impossible in most homes of the era. Although the machine required constant attention, its convenience was so significant that the Berwinds considered the effort a small price for a taste of the future. The heating system drew power from 3 enormous boilers that fed warmth to every major room. The challenge was not generating heat, but delivering fuel to the furnaces without disrupting the immaculate grounds or the refined atmosphere indoors. This challenge gave rise to one of the estate's most ingenious features, the underground coal tunnel. Running from Dixon Street directly to the basement, the tunnel allowed coal to arrive on small rail carts entirely out of sight. Workers could load and unload tons of fuel without ever approaching the house's main entrances or tracking soot across the manicured lawns. Ash was removed through the same hidden system, completing a cycle that kept the mechanical heartbeat of the home completely invisible. Throughout the estate, similar innovations reinforced the illusion that comfort happened effortlessly. A network of call boxes connected nearly every room to servant stations, allowing the family to summon assistance with the press of a discreet button. Mechanical lifts silently transported food from the basement kitchen to the butler's pantry. Airflow vents and built-in drainage channels ensured that moisture never compromised the structure. Even the placement of service hallways was a technical accomplishment, carefully embedded into the building to allow smooth, silent movement behind the scenes without interrupting the household's refined tranquility. What made these systems extraordinary was not just their novelty, but the way they worked in harmony with the architecture. The Elms was designed so that its advanced machinery remained completely hidden, like a stage performance where the audience never glimpses the ropes or pulleys that make the spectacle possible. Electricity, refrigeration, heating, communication, they all blended into the background, allowing the illusion of old-world splendor to dominate the senses. Yet, even with its cutting-edge systems, the house could not function on technology alone. Machines may have powered the residence, but they required human hands to operate, maintain, and respond to every demand that pulsed through its concealed veins. For the home to breathe with true vitality, it needed people, an organized, tireless, and disciplined workforce capable of sustaining the illusion of effortless grandeur. Behind every glowing chandelier, polished floor, and perfectly timed dinner service stood a quiet army whose presence was felt everywhere and seen almost nowhere. The soul of the Elms belonged to them, and without their daily labor, the great machine would fall silent. The grandeur of the house, with all its polished surfaces and perfect symmetry, depended on a force that most visitors never fully understood. Beneath the elegance lay an entire world operating in near silence, a world governed by schedules, hierarchy, and discipline. 40 individuals, each trained, each indispensable, formed the invisible machinery that allowed the Elms to function with the seamless grace expected of a residence modeled after European aristocratic estates. Without them, the chandeliers would dim, the gardens would wilt, and the illusion of effortless refinement would collapse within hours. Life for the staff unfolded primarily on the 3rd floor and in the service wings, areas designed for utility rather than beauty. The servants' quarters were modest but meticulously organized. Narrow hallways, compact bedrooms furnished with simple wooden beds, a handful of shared bathrooms, and storage spaces filled with uniforms, linens, and cleaning tools. These rooms carried a rhythm distinct from the rest of the house, quiet at night, active before dawn, and always responsive to the demands that filtered through the call box system. For the staff, work did not begin when the family awoke. It began long before, in the darkness of early morning, when the house needed to be prepared for the day ahead. The hierarchy was clear and strictly upheld. At the top stood the butler, the orchestrator of all indoor activity, responsible for supervising the footmen, managing household supplies, and ensuring that meals and service unfolded with the timing of a theatrical performance. Below him, footmen polished silver, opened doors, and stood ready during every formal meal, moving with a precision that reflected months, sometimes years, of training. The housekeeper oversaw chambermaids who were tasked with maintaining the bedrooms, tending to guest suites, and keeping the elaborate public rooms spotless. Even a single misplaced cushion could disrupt the visual harmony the family expected, making their work both relentless and essential. In the kitchen, a French-trained chef commanded his own miniature realm, supported by assistants who cleaned vegetables, maintained copper cookware, and prepared doughs, sauces, and pastries under his strict supervision. Meals at the Elms were not merely sustenance. They were presentations that reflected the family's status, requiring coordination between kitchen staff, footmen, and the butler to ensure proper pacing, temperature, and etiquette. Every dish traveled from the basement kitchen up through mechanical lifts before entering the butler's pantry, where it was arranged for service with quiet efficiency. Outside, the grounds demanded the attention of gardeners who spent each day coaxing perfection from 14 acres of carefully choreographed landscape. They trimmed hedges into crisp geometric shapes, raked gravel paths into clean lines, tended to seasonal blooms, and ensured that fountains remained clear and functioning. Their work, though performed outdoors, was as exacting as that inside the house. The gardens were not merely an aesthetic backdrop. They were a public statement, an outdoor extension of the family's identity. Allowing even small imperfections to linger would have been unthinkable. The expectation of invisibility shaped how the staff moved, spoke, and even thought. Elaborate networks of back staircases, narrow corridors, and hidden entrances allowed them to traverse the house without crossing paths with family or guests. Servants entered through a discreet side door, camouflaged by thick wisteria vines, a design choice intended to keep their comings and goings unseen. Their footsteps were absorbed by carpeted hallways. Their tools were stored behind seamless panels. Their presence was felt only in the immaculate results they produced. For the Berwinds and their peers, this invisibility was not merely a convenience, it was a hallmark of true luxury. A well-run household was one that appeared to function without effort, as though perfection simply existed rather than being fought for daily by dozens of skilled workers. Despite the discipline required, many staff members found pride in their work. Serving in a household of such scale offered stability, training, and an environment governed by clear expectations. Their contributions shaped the house's identity as profoundly as any architect or artist. Without their coordinated labor, the structure could not achieve the quiet grandeur that defined it. With the staff fully in place and the systems running in perfect harmony, the Elms was ready for the purpose for which it had been built. Its interiors gleamed, its gardens stretched outward in refined symmetry, and its machinery pulsed beneath the facade without a sound. The stage was set. The audience, Newport society, would soon arrive, and the house, complete at last, would step into its intended role as one of the most impressive settings for social life in America's gilded world. In the years that followed the completion of the estate, the Elms transformed from an ambitious architectural project into a living theater where the rituals of high society unfolded with impeccable rhythm. Each summer, when Newport's elite descended upon the coast in a glittering procession of carriages and later automobiles, the chateau became one of the city's most anticipated stages. Its luminous limestone facade, its sweeping alley, and its richly appointed interiors signaled that within its walls, a season of refined spectacle was about to begin. The social calendar of the Berwinds was as structured as any royal court. Invitations were handwritten, delivered with care, and accepted with enthusiasm by those fortunate enough to receive them. Guests entered through the grand doors and found themselves immersed in a world crafted down to the smallest detail. The dining room, glowing under clusters of electric bulbs disguised within elaborate chandeliers, hosted formal dinners where footmen in immaculate livery moved with quiet precision. Courses arrived in perfect sequence, each dish timed to appear exactly when expected, never too warm or too cool, never hurried, yet never delayed. The chef's creations, influenced by classical French cuisine, left guests whispering about the skill required to orchestrate such culinary choreography. Beyond dinners, the house became the venue for musicales, afternoon teas, and receptions attended by influential figures, business magnates, foreign dignitaries, politicians, and visitors of global prominence. Conversations drifted through the marble halls, accompanied by soft piano music, or the gentle hum of discussion under vaulted ceilings. The Venetian paintings, the Renaissance ceramics, and the curated collection of European treasures subtly reminded everyone that the Berwinds were not simply wealthy, but culturally authoritative. Their home suggested lineage, education, and the kind of cultivated identity that defined genuine standing within Newport society. The gardens, too, played their part. On warm evenings, guests strolled along manicured paths illuminated by lanterns, pausing beside fountains whose water glimmered in the twilight. The marble pavilions became quiet gathering spots where small groups lingered over conversation, framed by the whisper of leaves and the distant sound of the ocean. Every vista, every curve of hedge or sweep of lawn seemed designed to reinforce a single idea. The Berwinds belonged to the inner circle of America's most refined families. What made the Elms especially significant among Newport's grand residences was the coherence of its vision. Some estates dazzled with scale, others with novelty, but few achieved the seamless blend of European elegance and American innovation that defined this house. Visitors left with the impression that they had stepped into a world where time moved differently, where tradition, artistry, and modernity merged into a near-perfect illusion of aristocratic life. The Berwinds' residence was not merely admired, it was discussed, celebrated, and held up as a benchmark of tasteful grandeur. In those years, the Elms was not just a home, it was a symbol. Yet even within this period of brilliance, the first subtle shifts began to ripple beneath the surface. The household continued its flawless routines, but the woman who had shaped its aesthetic soul, who had chosen its art, guided its decor, and influenced its very identity, eventually faced her final chapter. Sarah, whose taste had elevated the residence from impressive to exceptional, experienced a quiet departure that left a profound absence in the home's emotional architecture. Her passing did not immediately alter the smooth operation of the estate, but it changed the center of gravity in ways felt more strongly as time moved forward. For the first time since its construction, the Elm stood at a crossroads. The machine still ran perfectly, but one of its guiding hands was gone, and the responsibility for its continuing grandeur would shift into new and uncertain territory. When Sarah's presence faded from the world, the house did not immediately fall silent. Her absence was felt most sharply in the details she once guided, the placement of flowers in the drawing room, the curation of table settings, the subtle choreography of color and light that shaped the home's atmosphere. Yet, despite the emotional weight of her departure, there was no question of closing the estate or retreating from the social life it had supported for decades. For Edward, the house represented far more than a seasonal retreat. It embodied his ascent, his identity, and the life he had built alongside the woman who helped define its character. Halting its rhythms would have meant allowing a part of that legacy to drift away. The solution emerged from within the family. Julia, Edward's younger sister, had long been a quiet observer of his world. Unlike Sarah, she had not shaped the home's cultural aesthetic, nor had she been deeply involved in its artistic evolution. But she understood the family's values, the discipline that defined their household, and the significance of maintaining the environment that had elevated the Berwind name. When Edward invited her to take on the role of hostess, she accepted with a decisiveness that suggested she recognized the responsibility as both an honor and a duty. Julia's approach to the estate differed sharply from Sarah's. She did not attempt to expand the art collection, refine the decor, or reinvent the experience of life at the Elms. Instead, she committed herself to preserving exactly what already existed. The house, with all its polished surfaces and carefully honed routines, became a kind of living museum, though not in the conventional sense. It was not curated for public viewing, but maintained in its original form because Julia believed continuity itself held value. She saw no reason to reshape a system that worked smoothly, or to modernize spaces that had served their purpose flawlessly for decades. During the summer season, she stepped confidently into the role of hostess. She organized dinners, oversaw social engagements, and ensured that the estate continued to operate with the same precision it had under Sarah's guidance. Servants who had once taken direction from one woman learned the new rhythms of another. Julia did not seek the spotlight, yet she commanded respect through consistency, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to the standards Edward expected. Her management style was efficient, practical, and far less focused on the subtleties of social maneuvering than her predecessor's approach. But it was effective. More importantly, Julia's stewardship extended beyond social functions. She developed a personal attachment to the estate's traditions, treating them not as relics of a bygone era, but as integral parts of the home's identity. Every ritual, whether the timing of meals, the upkeep of particular rooms, or the preparation of the gardens, was preserved exactly as it had been. She showed little interest in new technologies, new conveniences, or the changing habits of other wealthy families. To Julia, the house was complete. It did not need reinvention, it needed loyalty. As years passed, the contrast between the estate's frozen traditions and the rapidly evolving outside world grew more striking. Other Newport residences experimented with modern comforts or scaled back their operations to adjust to shifting economic realities. But the Elms remained a place where the callbox system still chimed for servants, where linens were washed and ironed by hand, and where the daily rhythms mirrored those of 1901 more closely than those of the 1930s. Julia had not set out to become a guardian of time, yet that is precisely what she became. Her commitment to the estate's original form preserved its character more thoroughly than any architect or artisan ever could. And as she settled into her role more deeply, the house began to slip away from the modern world entirely, entering a state of suspended elegance that no other estate in Newport would experience. What began as a practical solution to a family loss soon evolved into something far more remarkable. An environment where decades quietly passed without leaving a mark, where the clock seemed to slow, and where a single woman's resolve would hold an entire era in place long after it had vanished everywhere else. Under Julia's direction, the house entered a period unlike anything in Newport, or anywhere in America. While the world sprinted through technological revolutions, cultural shifts, and new expectations of modern comfort, the Elms remained anchored in a moment that refused to move. Visitors stepping inside during the 1940s or 1950s described the uncanny sensation of crossing an invisible threshold into another century. Nothing looked outdated, yet nothing reflected the conveniences other homes were gradually adopting. It was as though time had circled the estate and flowed around it, never passing through its doors. One of the most striking examples of this temporal suspension was the laundry room. By mid-century, even modest households relied on washing machines and electric dryers, marveling at how effortlessly they turned hours of labor into a manageable task. But in the basement of the Elms, laundry was still performed exactly as it had been at the dawn of the 20th century. Water was heated manually, linen scrubbed by hand, and sheets wrung out with physical strength rather than mechanical pressure. Afterward, everything was hung to dry across long lines beneath the house, filling the space with the warm scent of soap and damp fabric. Ironing required heavy, handheld irons that demanded both endurance and precision. Servants repeated these steps every day, maintaining a standard of presentation that echoed the early years of the estate. Upstairs, formal dinners remained grand productions, even as televisions flickered in living rooms across America, and casual dining replaced elaborate meals. The Elms continued to rely on footmen dressed in livery, uniforms that had gone out of fashion everywhere else. Their attire, polished shoes, and precise movements belonged to a different epoch, and yet were part of the daily script at the Berwind home. Guests found themselves transported into a world of ceremony that had all but disappeared from modern society. To Julia, these customs were not antiquated. They were essential expressions of her family's legacy. This resistance to modernization extended to nearly every aspect of life in the estate. The call box system, installed around 1901, remained the primary means of communication within the house. Simple push buttons connected rooms to annunciator panels in servant quarters, summoning assistance with a distinct metallic click. While other residences moved to telephones, intercoms, and bells, the Elms preserved its original method without question. Julia saw no reason to replace something that already worked flawlessly. To her, innovation was unnecessary if tradition could sustain the rhythm of the household. Even the lighting reflected an earlier philosophy. Though electric bulbs illuminated the rooms, they were arranged in clusters to mimic the soft glow of candlelight, a reminder that the house, despite its modern wiring, wished to remain visually tied to the genteel world it emulated. Appliances that transformed domestic labor elsewhere were never considered here. Refrigerators, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, none of these found a place in the estate. Instead, the servants continued to rely on muscle, routine, and skill, practicing methods that their predecessors had used in the early 1900s. What made this frozen state remarkable was Julia's unwavering commitment. She wasn't preserving the past as a hobby or out of nostalgia. She was living it. Her decisions were not dramatic gestures, but simple refusals to alter what she believed functioned perfectly. Each year reinforced the same routine: summers at the estate, winters in her suite at the Savoy Plaza Hotel, and a seamless transition between the two that demanded little adjustment from the staff. The house remained fully operational even when she was absent, maintained by a small team in winter and restored to full strength when the season arrived. But time, indifferent to her determination, continued its quiet progress. As the decades advanced, the gap between the estate's frozen world and the country outside grew wider. Staff members aged, new workers hesitated to take positions that required old-fashioned labor, and the cultural landscape shifted toward convenience over ceremony. While Julia held steadfastly to the traditions she inherited, the world beyond the Elms moved toward an era that valued efficiency, informality, and modernization. The estate stood as a perfectly preserved reflection of 1901, but the woman who maintained this fragile continuity was growing older. The rhythms she protected could not continue indefinitely. The air of timelessness that surrounded the estate was an illusion, an extraordinary one, but still vulnerable. And as Julia entered her later years, the question quietly arose: what would become of this unique world when its guardian could no longer hold time at bay? By the time Julia entered her mid-90s, the Elms existed in a state so singular that even longtime staff struggled to describe it. The house was fully alive, its systems humming, its routines intact, its rooms kept in pristine order. Yet the world beyond its gates had changed so thoroughly that the estate felt less like a functioning home and more like an island suspended above time. This was the final era in which the Elms lived exactly as it had been envisioned, a last chapter of authenticity before the modern world inevitably caught up to it. Each summer, Julia arrived with the quiet certainty of someone returning not to a property, but to a world she herself upheld. The morning she stepped through the doors each July, servants resumed their full rhythm. Footmen in formal livery polished silver that glowed under soft electric light. Chambermaids swept through hallways, ensuring every carpet lay perfectly aligned. Gardeners mapped out the week's tasks to keep the 14 acres gleaming with geometric precision. And at the center of it all stood a woman whose age demanded accommodation, but whose expectations never faltered. Daily life at the Elms during these final summers unfolded with a strange combination of grandeur and delicate absurdity. It was not uncommon for a visitor to see liveried footmen, attire expected in the courts of Europe, waiting respectfully while a radio played mid-century American news. A call box system designed before reliable telephones still summoned servants with crisp metallic clicks. The kitchen produced meals of impeccable structure, yet equipment remained stubbornly analog. Dozens of linens were washed by hand in an era when washing machines filled the basements of nearly every home in the nation. The contrast between ritual and reality created an atmosphere at once charming and surreal, as though an entire staff had agreed to sustain a shared vision that defied logic but honored loyalty. Julia herself moved through this world with remarkable clarity of purpose. She understood that she was the last living link to the home's origins, the only person who had known both Sarah's cultivated elegance and Edward's disciplined ambition. Her presence imbued the estate with continuity. Her choices upheld a way of living that had vanished everywhere else. Even as her pace slowed, her habits remained steady. She preferred to drive her own car, an unusual decision for someone of her generation and standing, and insisted that everything around her maintain the level of perfection she had guarded for decades. Staff members spoke quietly of how she inspected rooms with an eye as sharp as ever, noting whether surfaces gleamed or curtains fell in the proper folds. In these later years, the house seemed to mirror her, resolute, dignified, and untouched by change. Guests who visited felt as though they had crossed into a parallel timeline, one in which the Gilded Age had never receded. The garden fountains sparkled in the sunlight, just as they had in 1901. The drawing rooms glowed beneath clusters of early electric bulbs. Footmen stood ready at each threshold, a sight almost theatrical in the modern world. This coexistence of magnificence and outdated routine gave the estate an otherworldly charm, but it also underscored how precariously the entire system depended on one woman's will. For the staff, her presence was both inspiration and anchor. Many had served the household for decades and felt a personal commitment to maintain the traditions she cherished. Yet they also understood, perhaps more acutely than she did, that such a lifestyle could not be sustained indefinitely. Recruitment had become increasingly difficult. Younger workers saw domestic service as a profession from another era. Supplies that once arrived routinely now required special ordering. Even the maintenance of the coal-based systems and hidden machinery demanded knowledge that fewer people possessed. Still, for as long as Julia lived, these challenges remained invisible to her. The house operated as it always had, its routines hiding the strain beneath a polished surface. It was a triumph of loyalty and memory, a testament to what human dedication can achieve when anchored by conviction. But time, gentle though it may be, is insistent. As Julia's final summer approached, an unspoken understanding drifted through the estate. The world she protected could exist only as long as she did. When she quietly completed her last season at the Elms, at the age of 96, the staff sensed a shift, subtle but irreversible. Her presence had been the shield that kept modernity at bay. Without her, the house would stand exposed for the first time in its history. And soon, that moment arrived, the absence of its guardian, and with it, the opening of a chapter unlike any the estate had ever faced. When Julia's presence finally receded from the halls she had guarded for nearly 4 decades, the estate entered a silence it had never known. For the first time since 1901, the Elms had no guiding hand, no daily rituals, no steady heartbeat of routines shaped by a singular vision. The staff dispersed. The rooms, once kept in a state of perpetual readiness, settled into stillness, and the mantle of ownership passed to a man who saw the house not as an heirloom or a legacy, but as an overwhelming problem waiting to be solved. Charles E. Dunlap, Julia's nephew through her sister's line, inherited the property with a sense of obligation rather than pride. He was in his 70s himself, living a life shaped by urban convenience and modern sensibilities. The notion of maintaining a 40-room mansion that required an army of workers to function felt not only impractical, but completely detached from the world he inhabited. To him, the estate was a vast relic, beautiful, yes, but burdensome beyond measure. The realities of ownership confronted him immediately. Property taxes alone represented a staggering sum, enough to sustain a comfortable lifestyle for an entire family. Insurance premiums for a house filled with historic architecture, custom interiors, and fragile systems climbed even higher. Utilities for heating and electricity consumed funds at a rate that would have been unimaginable in Julia's era. And then there was the staff, or rather, the expectation of what a house like this required. Even a skeleton crew would cost a fortune. Running the estate at anything close to its former scale was beyond consideration. Moreover, the economic landscape of the early 1960s held no sympathy for grand mansions built in a different age. America was moving briskly towards suburban living, compact homes, efficient layouts, and modern appliances. The idea of investing vast sums into a house that demanded constant attention, specialized maintenance, and traditional labor felt outdated and financially irresponsible. From Dunlap's perspective, the Elms was not a monument to preserve. It was an anchor threatening to drag him into financial ruin. He evaluated its possibilities with a practical, unsentimental eye. Could he afford to keep it? No. Could he modernize it? The cost would be astronomical. Could he repurpose it? There was no viable model that wouldn't require millions of dollars and years of reconstruction. The simplest answer, emotionally difficult for others, but clear to him, was to free himself of the burden entirely. Developers, sensing opportunity, stepped forward quickly. 14 acres of prime land on Bellevue Avenue was a dream few companies could resist. The house itself, however magnificent, represented an obstacle rather than an asset. Its systems were outdated, its upkeep colossal, its marketability minimal. What they valued was the land beneath it, not the chateau that had stood proudly for 60 years. Their proposed solution was blunt and efficient. Clear the property and build something commercially viable. A shopping center, modern, profitable, and in demand. It was the kind of development that reflected the priorities of the era: accessibility, convenience, and economic return. Gone were the days when Gilded Age palaces defined the skyline of Newport. Now, practicality reigned, and the Elms, along with its gardens, pavilions, and history, was in the way. When Dunlap agreed to the sale, his decision reverberated through the estate like a quiet but devastating verdict. Furniture would be auctioned, artworks dispersed, the grounds left untended, and the house, with all its engineering marvels and decades of immaculate preservation, would soon face a word it had never encountered, one that carried the weight of finality even without being spoken aloud. For the first time since its creation, the Elms heard the term that signaled not transformation, but disappearance, a term that marked the end of countless buildings once considered untouchable: demolition. The announcement of the auction marked the moment when the Elms began to unravel, not through neglect or disaster, but through the slow dismantling of everything that had given it meaning. What had once been a perfectly preserved world, maintained with near devotional precision, was about to be emptied piece by piece. The process would not involve flames, floods, or dramatic collapse. Instead, the estate would lose its soul in the most methodical way imaginable, under the polite tapping of auctioneer gavels and the quiet shuffling of bidders' catalogs. Dealers, collectors, and representatives from museums arrived from across the country, drawn by the promise of acquiring objects that rarely emerged into the market. They walked through the rooms like explorers in a forgotten palace, tracing the outlines of craftsmanship that had defined the Berwind legacy for decades. Venetian canvases that once framed grand dinners now hung under temporary lighting, tagged with lot numbers. Renaissance ceramics, carefully selected by Sarah, left their glass vitrines for padded crates. The jades that had glimmered in display cases, treasured for their subtle hues and fine carving, passed into new hands with barely a pause for reflection. Furniture, once placed according to Allard's precise interior choreography, stood pulled away from walls, separated from context. Gilded chairs, marble-top tables, carved cabinets, and delicate sofas were grouped in rows like performers waiting for their final curtain call. But without the room's architectural embrace, each piece felt strangely diminished, its significance hollowed by displacement. What had once formed a cohesive environment, a tapestry of art, architecture, and atmosphere, was now reduced to items listed by dimensions and starting bids. As the auction commenced, the rhythm of dispersal quickened. A museum acquired a Venetian painting, ensuring it would survive but condemning it to a life far removed from its original setting. Private collectors purchased French furniture that would later appear in estates hundreds of miles away. Dealers bought in bulk, intending to resell pieces whose origins would gradually fade from memory. The movement was constant. Hands raised, paddles lifted, numbers called, and objects removed from the rooms one by one. Within days, the cumulative effect became palpable. The dining room, once a glowing theater of European art and American aspiration, stood bare, its walls marked only by the faint outlines where canvases had hung. The drawing room, emptied of its vitrines and ceramics, felt suddenly smaller, as though its breath had been taken away. Bedrooms were stripped of fabric, mattresses, and furnishings, until only the architectural bones remained. Even hallways, which had long echoed with the soft footsteps of servants, stretched in quiet emptiness, revealing expanses of bare floorboards that had rarely seen daylight. The house itself seemed to react to the loss. Without the weight of its objects, the rooms felt lighter, yet strangely fragile, as though exposed to an air they had never been meant to breathe. The polished surfaces dulled slightly, shadows sharpened. The absence of personal effects, no photographs, no books, no familiar accents, highlighted how much of a home's identity rests not in its walls, but in the things that fill them. By the end of the auction, the Elms stood as a hollow structure, its grandeur reduced to architectural form without purpose. The marble mantels remained, as did the paneled walls and ceiling ornamentation. But these features now felt detached, unable to speak, without the furnishings that once completed their narrative. It was as if the spirit of the house had been carefully extracted, leaving behind a beautiful but silent shell. Outside, the gardens still stretched in elegant symmetry, but even they seemed to anticipate the imminent change, their carefully tended order clashing with the emptiness inside. The once living estate, powered by staff, illuminated by ritual, animated by cycles of summer life, was now nothing more than a container awaiting its fate. All that remained was the outer form, a magnificent box of limestone and steel, perfectly built yet utterly bereft. And the world knew what would likely come next. The plans were already drawn, the developers had already spoken, the machinery was ready. The final step would not come through dispersal or quiet removal, but through a single shattering force, an impact meant to erase everything the house had ever been. With the last crate removed and the final dealer's truck rolling down Bellevue Avenue, the Elms stood in a rare and unsettling state of total vulnerability. Its rooms, once alive with light, movement, and ritual, echoed with emptiness. Its halls, stripped of art and furniture, felt cavernous and exposed. And for the first time since its completion in 1901, the chateau no longer belonged to a family, a set of traditions, or even a way of life. It belonged to a timeline. The developers had set that timeline with precision. Permits were secured. Engineering assessments completed, heavy machinery scheduled. The plan was clear. Demolition would begin within 3 weeks. The limestone facade, the steel skeleton, the gardens sculpted with geometric perfection, all were to be erased to make way for a commercial development. In the eyes of the new owners, the land held far more value than the structure resting upon it. The former was usable. The latter was an obstacle. Progress, as they saw it, required removal. And so, a date was circled on the calendar, a quiet administrative mark that symbolized an abrupt end to 6 decades of elegance, labor, artistry, and memory. Few buildings in America had ever been so thoroughly preserved only to face destruction so suddenly. The irony was stark. The very discipline that kept the Elms frozen in time for half a century now made it appear outdated and unprofitable to modernize. The mansion's plight reflected a broader cultural shift. By the early 1960s, few Americans saw value in maintaining vast Gilded Age estates. Their upkeep was expensive, their purpose unclear, and their architectural language belonged to a world the nation had largely moved beyond. Suburbia thrived, convenience reigned. The idea of saving a palace for the sake of beauty or history had not yet taken hold in the American imagination. The Elms seemed destined to follow the path of many great houses, quietly erased to make room for something more practical. Construction crews stood ready. Contracts were signed. Equipment waited. The structure's fate was sealed not by hostility, but by indifference. And yet, something unexpected began to stir. News of the planned demolition spread beyond developer offices and legal documents. Preservationists, historians, and Newport residents who had witnessed the slow loss of other grand estates felt a growing urgency. People who had never stepped inside the Elms suddenly recognized its significance, not just as an architectural achievement, but as a rare surviving window into a vanished era. Photographs circulated, articles were written, conversations rose in volume and intensity. In a nation beginning to grapple with the idea of cultural heritage, the Elms became a test case. Would America allow one of its last authentic Gilded Age households, preserved so completely by accident and devotion, to vanish in the name of commercial progress? Day by day, momentum shifted. Donations trickled in, then poured. A preservation group rallied. Negotiations unfolded, tense, uncertain, and driven by the knowledge that failure meant irreversible loss. The developers, faced with mounting public pressure and a viable alternative presented by preservation advocates, eventually agreed to sell. The deal was struck just in time. The demolition schedule, once so confidently set, was canceled. The machinery stood down, and the chateau that had been 3 weeks away from destruction found itself saved by a combination of collective will and historical awakening. The Elms survived not because it was profitable, but because people realized what would be lost if it disappeared. Its rescue marked a turning point in American preservation, proving that cultural memory could be powerful enough to counter economic logic. It demonstrated that beauty, craftsmanship, and history held value even when they could not be measured in dollars per square foot. The house endures today, its rooms restored, its gardens reborn, its story retold to thousands who walk through its doors. Yet one question lingers, the same one that haunted those nearing the brink of its destruction. How did a home from another century manage to survive when its end had already been scheduled, down to the week, the day, and the hour? The answer lies in the unlikely convergence of timing, awareness, and determination. The Elms lived because enough people decided it mattered, because memory outran machinery, because a nation that almost lost a masterpiece realized, just in time, that some things are too rare to surrender. And so, the chateau still stands, a quiet testament to what can be saved when the past is not abandoned and when even a few determined voices refuse to let history fall to dust.